Chaal.Chaal.Agency, I think, began literally out of two of us meeting when we were doing our masters at SEPT University. And it sort of the origins came from the fact that both of us were very keen on trying to understand what happens to the larger set of the population that cannot afford design services and cannot afford to pay for them. So, who is catering to that group? And um, so that was one thing. And then the second thing, both of us were very much interested in challenging the traditional formats of what is understood as architecture and the design of buildings. And therefore, both Sebastian, through his master's and mine, we were very keen on understanding the role of people in design and how design itself is also very dynamic and how that can be formed. So that is one part of it. The name has more like a tongue-in-cheek for us, like it was because all our projects and most of the work that we do, we're always trying to be very playful. So the name also comes out of that play of words. In this case, given that I'm Gujarati, it kind of the seed was in Ahmedabad, Gujarat for us, where this started. So we were looking at Chaal-Chaal having these two meanings, one in Gujarati, one in Hindi. The Hindi meaning being strategy or like what is your next move in a more game format. But at the same time in Gujarati, it's like chal, like, come, let's go. So we kind of, and we feel that sort of resonated a lot with what we wanted to do with our practice. We want to sort of make a difference. We want to mobilize ourselves and people around us to take on the next move to start making a difference in society. And at the same time, agency again has that sort of dual meaning, one being the organization itself, but at the same time, agency, here we wanted to talk about the agency of people and the voices of people that we wanted to bring forward through our practice. So that's really the story of the name.
This in terms of the issues that we believe are shared across these geographies, is, I mean, this reminds us of a book that is called Why Nations Fail. So what is interesting about this book is that it talks about how the difference between thriving nations vis-a-vis nations that have intrinsic fundamental difficulties or challenges lies fundamentally in how institutions are formed, and whether those institutions are either inclusive or whether those institutions are extractive. When institutions are inclusive, you set up an overarching frame guided by law that allows every citizen, disregard of their background, their identity, whatever precondition they have as individuals, as part of whatever community, to access services, capacities, spaces, etc., etc. And therefore, there's an overarching sort of mainframe in the construction of the state that allows you, disregarding of who you are, to eventually, move ahead towards X direction. On the other hand, extractive institutions are formed and are strategically set in such a way that certain groups are benefited from the larger sort of production of the state, and these institutions ensure that these specific groupings stay in those positions of privilege, and by default there's an exclusionary approach towards a larger part of the population. Now, we believe that, of course, these are highly, I mean, these are contexts of a lot of gradients and of a lot of variables, and of course, are contingent to conditions of history, of geography, or specific cities, etc. But we believe that in an overall, there is an overarching sort of extractive institutional approach in the construction of our states. And I think for us, that has been kind of like one of the fundamental issues that we try to address in whatever capacity we have as citizens, right? We're not working from a top-down approach where we have larger companies or larger powers. We're working as citizens that have the capacity to act as citizens with a certain degree of knowledge in something. Now, within this larger context, within this situation of extractive institutions, we believe that simultaneously that also leads to the creation of certain power voids that in many ways allow for social organizations and small political arrangements to erupt either towards positive, larger benefits or negative, of course. From our perspective, from our more optimist perspective, we do believe that those pockets of social organization and social initiatives are incredibly important and hold enormous potential in the development or in the formulation of different forms of development, aside from the sort of normative, hegemonical understanding of what development should be. And we usually try to tap into those initiatives as close as possible. Now, in terms of the commonalities between the contexts in which we work, I wouldn't put it in terms of city specific. I would put it into larger context between Colombia and India. I think the commonalities have to do with, of course, our post-colonial condition, and therefore all of the derived values and difficulties that brings forth. The extreme inequality that governs or that is present in both our contexts, despite the fact that both contexts, both countries, both larger populations have a great degree of wealth. And of course, then there's a myriad of other conditions like climatic traditions, climate approach to the climate, constructive approaches, inventiveness, jugaad, et cetera. Now, just to sort of wrap this up, in terms of the differences that I believe that are fundamentally sort of set those contexts apart, are the fact that on the one hand, India has this consistent drive towards change and movement. There's this sort of there's this notion in the Indian context that is quite visible, the fact that everything is constantly under transformation, under change. And we believe that that's, I mean, in many ways, it can be a difficulty, it can be quite negative, but we see that as an asset because in the Colombian context, there is a very, very difficult, I mean, very problematic drive towards normalization. Of course, I'm generalizing, but if we were to compare both contexts, India has a lot more. It's far more open in terms of larger questions of development.
For us, I think the initial stages was really Sebastian and I self-initiating projects, going around the city,
Knocking
trying.
on doors.
Yeah. So I mean, that's where we really began. So one was to see where we could be useful. And then once we identified let's say the group of people that needed some kind of assistance or some kind of facilitation in terms of design, we would then sort of plug ourselves in. Now, of course, this means that we, in many cases, were outsiders, which meant that we needed to team up with someone on the inside or with someone who has enough insights on what is going on ground. And that led us to then identifying either NGOs or local leaders who then became very critical parts of how they were able to help us, get introduced into the community. And then from there, we were able to then, over multiple chais, build relationships on ground with the people there, with making sure that all stakeholders were involved in the process. So we would make sure that it was just not the dominant voices that were being heard, but we ensured that even the voices of women, children, let's say the older citizens of the community were making part of the processes. Now, this sort of, I think over time, this led us to starting to develop tools of engagement or participation. Um, our, one of our favorite tools has been game boards. So we've been using this idea of gamification of, let's say, a survey form. Now, to go with a survey form, you can certainly get all of the answers in a more direct way. But for us, I think it was important to find the in-betweens of those questions. So we were able to then take that survey form, help like gamify it, take it as a game board, which also helped us to be a little bit more playful. And we realized also through this act of playing, there is this sort of shedding of inhibitions, and the conversations were much more fluid, which meant that we were able to understand far more better the social dynamics of how the different stakeholders interacted with each other, their interdependencies, or what were their sort of more, let's say, needs that they needed to be addressed. So these tools kind of have evolved over time. So we've gone from game boards, but with our recent project in Bhuj, which was supported by Coach, which is called Off Portable Tool Sheds, we were able to design three very distinct black boxes that could cater to three stages of design. The first being co-mapping, which is where we go through these processes of getting to know the users or the stakeholders. And then from there, we would go into a process of co-design where we could co-build or imagine or reimagine what is it that is required. And then from there, we would, go back to the drawing board, hit on the design, work out some scale models, take them back, make sure that the scale models were not static, so we would make them very movable, such that the feedback could eventually be seen on the go. And I think this, with our latest project, we realized that this was a very good comprehensive way to collaborate and to make sure that the voices were involved in all stages of design.
So, I mean, for us, this idea of what you call microarchitectures, we call them similarly light infrastructures. The basic idea is that they generate agency. They allow us to, together with the collaboration that Kruti was just mentioning, to give people possibilities. We're very clear on the fact that we don't come to a context to save anyone. We're not going to change anybody's life in itself. We come as professionals to by identifying certain opportunities, and by identifying certain opportunities and potentialities and people that hold capacities to change, we try to support them via our own expertise, which lie in I mean, there's a technical expertise, there's an aesthetic expertise, there's spatial expertise, etc., etc. And wherever we're able to kind of fill the gap in terms of the development of those larger processes that are already in place, we insert ourselves there. Now, we believe that all of these, some of these expertise, in terms of design, place making, etc., these allow people to do much more, or at least it allows to within certain contexts to choose within different sort of options, or at least opens up certain avenues that otherwise, if you just do four walls and a roof, they wouldn't be met. And therefore, the idea of having these light infrastructures basically allow us to allow people to generate agency, which means forming certain larger organizations, meetings, etc., the creation of knowledge, the access of resources, bringing forward different other organizations, and therefore kind of generate change. But in overall, what we do, these light infrastructures is really quite small in terms of the larger sort of mechanisms that are in place. We of course try to sort of try to expand as much as possible our intervention, but we're very conscious of the fact that both our capacities, but also our impact is always limited, right? And changes needs to come from the people that are, confronting issues on a daily basis. And although we're pretty much involved in some periods of these larger developments, we're not the protagonists.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think for us also there was a conscious choice of calling the work infrastructures is also because we found architecture in its terminology a little bit burdened by its own meaning.
And reductive.
And reductive, yeah. So for us, it was important to sort of have a term that helped us sort of expand precisely that meaning and go into different design projects that not necessarily then the outcome is a building. And it in many ways it also helped us challenge what is infrastructure as understood as these very big, large interventions that build a city, but we also wanted to look at the smaller interventions that became infrastructures to serve a city. So it was also very important to bring that forward for us.
In many ways, we usually don't take spatial vocabularies on face value. We try not to reproduce elements that we encounter in the context as they are, or even import um, spatial elements or languages or formal conditions as they are. We believe that part of the exercise of design, or the exercise of understanding an issue from a spatial perspective, is also about identifying those fundamental or very crucial familiar elements that exist in a context, that relate to cultural traits, that relate to social significance, aesthetic appeal, etc., poetic manifestation, and so on and so forth. And we try to, instead of taking them on face value again, we try to defamiliarize them and to sort of present them in a different way. In that sense, that larger aspiration, which of course I don't believe we're not quite there yet. I think this is a lifetime sort of a project, is eventually to create a vocabulary that has character in itself, that sidelines all of those characteristics that otherwise determine, as you say, either indigenous or colonial vocabularies. We don't intend to reproduce them, not because we don't see value in them, but because we feel that anything needs transformation, that everything needs a certain degree of tweaking, specifically when you're talking. I mean, if you're looking at it from the perspective of design, right?
Yeah. One of our biggest challenge is always funding. Given that these are self-initiated projects, or these are projects that are unfortunately for people who don't have the capital to invest in sort of developing certain infrastructures around them. So it has taken a while for us to crack it, because also, of course, on a personal level, we as a company we need to sustain ourselves, but as individuals we need to sustain ourselves. So over time it's taken us very long, and I think we're still struggling with it. But we've discovered, or we've found avenues that have turned out to be very fruitful in the process. So I think, again, this is through our collaborations, through a lot of proposal writing. We've managed to, find grants that can sustain these projects and the moving forward of these projects, but also being able to tie up with NGOs who have access to government funds has also been very good for us to take forward some of the projects. But I think something that for the last 1 year, that has helped us is two things. One is the CSR funding, or the corporate social responsibility, through which we are able to gather some funds, but also finding this, or discovering or finding the patron or patronage that can help us sustain ourselves, wherein the company can run without necessarily falling apart, but at the same time having that sort of smooth transition into making sure the projects take place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I feel perhaps just to complement what Kruti is saying, another larger challenge that I feel we faced from the beginning of CCA is basically the fact that making people buy into what we're doing. I feel that I mean, for us is absolutely obvious. I mean, there are I mean, conditions in the city that are movable, that are dynamic, that are temporal, that are and so on and so forth. And there's a vast population that depends on these infrastructures. But for some reason, there is either a drive to ignore these infrastructures and these circumstances, take them for granted, or otherwise replace them, drive to kind of make them disappear. I mean, because they are synonymous with, backwardness, and synonymous with poverty, and these sort of larger myths that, I mean, of course, there's a context to that, but we believe that all of these conditions that characterize quite radically the Indian urbanity at large, we see them as assets. We see them as grounds for great possibility. Not only because a lot of people depend on them, and therefore there's a drive to, we also need to cater to this larger audience, but because all of these systems and all of these grounds of spatial production hold a great degree of inventiveness, and hold a great degree of intelligence and sensibility, and so on. It has its problems, of course, and a lot of them. But I think neither ignoring nor suppressing or prohibiting them is an appropriate or sensible, approach. We believe that as designers, we have the obligation, or the responsibility to respond to these conditions, and see how through our capacities, make whatever exists right now can eventually improve, right? Instead of simply, replacing them on view of some larger imagination of what the street needs to look like, or how the city needs to be, or how one needs to behave in public space. I mean, I think these imaginations that are always feeding from outside, always top down, are not really, and we believe are fairly regressive.
But they're also West-led.
Of course.
So there's a lot of like, we want to be like the West, but that sort of, and I think that's where we like Sebastian said, we struggle is to change that perception, to see value in what is around us presently. I think for us, one of our, I think, like very dear projects has been Gyan Ashray, which is this classroom that we did on the terrace for in Behrampura in Ahmedabad. And I think it was, for us, it was just sheer joy after 10 days of rigorously working towards building it with students of Sept University as part of the winter workshop. We were able to, just see how proud the women were that they there was a space that was theirs, there was a space that they could identify as, this is where I go to study and I go to learn. But I think the more like after about a month into that project, we were receiving phone calls saying, "Acha, now that we use that space to have birthday parties, to celebrate Independence Day." So in many ways, it started as a classroom, but it became a community space. It became a space where people went to celebrate, people went to learn, exchange knowledge, and I think that was for us one of the biggest compliments that we received. I think other than that, another project that comes to my mind is Pushpa Ben, who was one of the community leaders for this project. And when we decided, I think this was during the pandemic, we ran this international competition called Project Lari 2. Sorry, one at that moment. We've done 2 cycles. So the initiative came out of Pushpa Ben giving us a call and telling us that it's pandemic. I'm not able to find work, but I want to start a clothes business, but I don't have a cart. So can we do something about that? So we ran this competition, and we were able to build the cart and kind of hand it over to Pushpaben. And she what she told us is that how much of a difference a designed cart made to her, because it sort of raised a lot of curiosity amongst people passing by, and that sort of increased her business. So we were able to see this sort of direct impact of design on livelihood in a very small, like one little project. But I think that was also very validating for us to know that we are in many ways making some difference.
Perhaps more recently is our project in Bhuj. I think that was quite interesting as well, to sort of understand how these smaller infrastructures in what we now call inconstant infrastructures precisely support different forms of marginalized livelihood that at the same time how these infrastructures allow those livelihoods to prosper or to evolve. So one in particular was one of the women that we were working in Bhuj, that she got the one of the laris that we made,
Which one?
the middle one,
Komal Ben.
Komal Ben. That eventually, what it was very interesting because we were working with the Satwara community that basically exchange vessels for old clothes. So they go door to door and they exchange it, and then they repair the clothes, and then they sell them, on on the market. So it's a very interesting circular economy that exists traditionally since very long. And I mean, that used to happen till very recently in larger urban areas, but now it's been sort of receded into more peripheral rural areas. But anyways, Komal Ben in particular, that started through this business, and that was her livelihood via this Lari that we co-designed with them, and that we weren't expecting. She quickly moved from selling clothes and doing all this hassle, which is, I mean, economically, it barely allowed them to make ends meet. Basically, in many ways, and on a regular basis, they would go into losses and so on and so forth. She was able to quickly move from that economy into, for instance, she was selling chaat from her cart,
Bhel puri
Bhel
and
puri, yeah,
chaat.
which is very interesting because that allowed her to, on the one hand, to have a more
A sense of security, I think,
yes,
because otherwise they would need to on a daily basis rent cars, and there are days where they if they're late they don't find a car. So this sort of in many ways gave her a sense of security.
yeah, aside from the fact that, for instance, what they do when they go around exchanging the vessels for clothing, we're talking about Bhuj, that in summer temperatures go up to 50 degrees Celsius, which is, so in that sense, only young women are able to do the ferries, and therefore there's this sort of physical capacity that comes into place, and of course there's which is also highly detrimental to health, etc., etc. So in that sense, by establishing a place where she could construct her own economy, outside of these detrimental processes for her own health and her own sort of livelihood. I think for us that was fantastic, and she keeps sending us pictures of her of her bell puris and so on and so forth, which is, I mean, it looks pretty good.
But I think it's not just that. It was also very nice to see. So the project was focused on the women vendors. So the designs came out of the processes that we did with the women. But invariably these carts turned out to be really like the way by which we figured out the steering system. They became much more easy to move around, that then we started having all the men come. Like when we did our exhibition in Bhuj, the men came and they're like, we also want a cart like this. It's so easy to move around. And so it kind of also in many ways helped us understand that if you design for the more vulnerable stakeholder, by default everyone benefits. It kind of put that in perspective to us.
Absolutely.
I think so. I'll talk from my own education being in Bombay. Um, what happens in Bombay is that there is, very predefined scales that you go. You start from like a little house of an artist to, let's say, a school, then you'll go to a slightly larger institute and then a high rise, and then you reach your thesis. Now, at what point do students really face reality of a large set of population? They're never really exposed to that. And I believe that if we are able to change briefs of the studios that are offered, and we're able to sort of expand on the notion that we can look at what is the built form that occupies a space, but also what is around it. And I think that in many ways should help to tackle or at least create empathy within the students who are coming out as architects. And I think that should be the biggest change that we need to bring.
Yeah, I agree. I think precisely this idea of having empathy as a fundamental core element that allows students to thrive. I think that certainly will make a huge difference. This implies having more one-to-one contact with other contexts and other people, being able to understand how people of different contexts and how other different contexts work, as a way to not establish that otherness, but rather understand that ultimately there's a lot of things that we have in common and a lot of things that we can, contribute to each other. Um, Similarly, in terms of the larger framework of education, a greater degree of political and social consciousness, I think, is quite important. I mean, we face that quite often, that students, which is understandable. If you don't have a school that doesn't incentivize your capacity to understand or to be able to have a certain degree of a permeability towards other political or social visions. I mean, and the difficulty is precisely the fact that many students are completely disconnected from other realities, and they have a very sort of reduced understanding of what things like class, caste, gender, and other tags are, and they see them in a very reductive manner. Um, of course, this, however, cannot be sort of set as a simply or necessarily just as a sociological approach. We believe that at the same time, there needs to be a very strong financial education that supports that vision. I think that these two need to be quite well complemented, and that's usually a huge lacking in architecture schools, where entrepreneurship and financial understanding, it's usually
Hmm.
not an issue, or is not seen as something that we need to discuss, and therefore we go out of school thinking that money is just going to rain from the sky, and then we you know um on the other hand, I think incentivizing inventiveness for us is fundamental, uh, particularly from the side of frugal technological inventiveness, where at a moment in civilization where there's this sort of, we have a great degree of access to knowledges, capacities, and resources that 20 years, 30 years ago people didn't have. And therefore we have the capacities, or we are in the historical situation that would allow us to consistently and radically reinvent our context towards a positive um, far more positive future. We also believe that educating towards repair and sustenance, rather than just creating these spectacular pieces of vanity that architects love. It's quite a pressing matter. We believe that we need to concentrate far more in how do you repair something, how do you make it work, how do you make it last, how do you disassemble it? What do you do with the waste that it produces? I mean, all of these questions are usually taken for granted in not all, but many architecture studios and many architecture schools are not even concerned with that level of questioning. And therefore, what you have is students that just know how to do, pretty facades and eventually draw a bathroom or,
Yeah, I think I would just like to add one more thing is that I also feel that now education needs to also push students to think of architecture not as a profession that you can do as an individual in your own office, kind of be by yourself and spend hours kind of, dwelling on design. But I think we need to push architects and students to now collaborate. And I think that is the way forward because soon the profession will need to speak to multiple agencies to be able to get something done. And sometimes I feel the students are just not prepared for that. So I think that that is very important. And I think at the same time, I also feel that there is a lacking in being able to have the skills of communicating with or with the users and stakeholders that you are designing for. So, how do you help the students build those tools of communication? I think is also very critical, which some schools are doing and they're doing really well. But I think we need to make it a little bit more widespread.
Yeah, and I think adding to that, I mean, I feel that architecture at large is going through this crisis of relevance, either because there's a consistent um, sort of sidelining from larger capitals, or by replacing architectural thought through AI in different forms of spatial production.
But also contractors.
And of course, in the fact that you don't, I mean, legally, architects are not necessary, are not required in construction, which is, of course. Now, from that perspective, we need to start educating young professionals such that they see architecture as a way to address issues and not necessarily as a way to design buildings. Buildings is just a
A
small
part of it,
a
yeah.
small spectrum of the larger sort of scheme of possibilities that design thinking allows you to do, and therefore educating young professionals such that we're able to address the difficulties that now are coming. The fact that, I mean, subsequently we have, I mean, we have less capacity to design buildings, to eventually do interiors, etc., etc. So what are these young architects going to do? And therefore, we need to start understanding how we can utilize AI, quickly jump from one profession to the other, be able to utilize architectural thinking in order to assess or move forward or develop different kinds of areas of knowledge and the economy that don't require necessarily an architectural solution, in the sense that don't require a building. And in that sense, it's about, I mean, if you teach someone to nail a nail, do a nail with a hammer, they're always gonna be thinking, or they're gonna see everything as a hammer, as a nail, right? If you, therefore, the idea is to think beyond that sort of linear condition that architectural thought and architectural thinking is about making buildings and designing these pristine museums and whatnot, but rather is a way to address the different kind of conditions that our very complex world is consistently throwing at us.